packet pushers.
Welcome back to Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. As always, I'm Jennifer J.J. Manella here with Drew Conry Murray, and today we're talking about tabletop security exercises and specifically what they are, why you need them, who's involved, who wants to be involved, who doesn't want to be involved, and how they compare to other security assessments. And if you like Dungeons and Dragons, well, this episode's for you. It's basically cyber D&D. And today our guest is Johna Johnson, CEO and founder of Nemertes, a research and consulting company, and also the host of Heavy Strategy. All right, Drew, but before we get started, let's talk about the stuff that's happening this week and all of the different security news headlines.
Yeah, we got a few to get through. So just an update on the Change Healthcare attack. The ransomware attackers that hit Change Healthcare used stolen credentials to access a Citrix remote access server. The server wasn't protected with multi-factor authentication. The CEO of United Healthcare, which owns Change Healthcare, confirmed the lack of multi-factor authentication. In a Senate hearing, the CEO also confirmed that he did pay a $22 million ransom.
The words while sitting in a Senate hearing is just not something any CEO or executive wants. You don't want that after your name and your company. Yeah, so this is the one that's been the gift that keeps giving in terms of news. I guess we've had several of those the past few weeks, but this one was interesting because I think maybe we all sort of hoped that there was some sophisticated something happening here. But again, it was just the basic vanilla 101 first tier of things we should be doing that wasn't being done. But it happened to impact about 1/3 of U.S. citizens, which was kind of sucky.
Yes. The other thing is that if the U.S. Senate is getting familiar with the notion of multi-factor authentication, then you know security has crept way, way too much into our public lives.
It's going to be interesting, too, because I think one of the things they're examining is in their explanation, I'm not going to say justification, but explanation of this, the Change Healthcare organization that they had acquired was not fully integrated into United Healthcare's processes and procedures and blah, blah, blah. We know that can take a while.
Sure.
But one of the things being questioned is, should any single entity with that much control that impacts, 1/3 or more of Americans be able to be the only player, or does that need to be more distributed?
Yes, that is also an issue. That is a different regulatory issue, but I think something that definitely needs looking at. And moving on, JJ, we recently did an article on post-quantum cryptography, and there's actually some post-quantum news.
There is. So in episode 12, we talked to a guest. We covered some of post-quantum crypto technologies. And one of the things we started saying was just do it now, do it often, do it early, and start integrating this into anything you can and making sure that your vendors support it. So some of the news shaking out over the past week is, Google released their Chrome 124 this month / last month, because we're splitting between April and May now. And long story short, it's breaking stuff. So a lot of sysadmins have said that web applications, appliances, and servers are dropping the connections after that client hello TLS handshake.
Yeah, that's because they're using a new so-called quantum resistant algorithm in this update in 124.
Yeah. But it's impacting everything that you might be connecting to as a web server. So it's also all of the networky stuff. So our security appliances, firewalls, switching, routing, all of the big names in that, Palo, Fortinet, et cetera. So there are some things to do. We'll drop links in the show notes as always. But yeah, the quantum resistant key agreement algorithm, if something can't negotiate with that, it should fall back to classic crypto. That's not happening all the time. So there are ways to test it, and there are ways in the interim to disable that either on the browser yourself as a user or through a corporate policy.
Yeah, and Google said for the time being, they're going to allow you to disable it, but at some point in the future, they will not allow disabling. So this isn't something you can just put off forever. And I think as more quantum resistant algorithms get rolled out across different infrastructure, we're going to be seeing more issues like this. So I guess it's good we sort of start testing the waters and see how this works, because we are going to run into problems like this as post-quantum or quantum resistant algorithms start to get into the infrastructure.
Yeah, it makes sense to test it. It's also not just Chrome. It's also the current version of Edge. Not that anybody actually uses Edge browser, but if you do, you want to test that as well.
Yes, millions of people not using it.
Somebody is somewhere.
Somebody somewhere, yes. And our last story for the day, and this will sort of touch on, our main discussion later on, is that U.S. government agencies, including CISA, the FBI, and the NSA, have released a joint advisory. They're warning that Russian-associated actors are targeting OT systems at U.S. water facilities. This includes things like water distribution and water treatment plants. Attacks include configuring equipment to exceed normal parameters, to suppressing alarms, and locking out operators by changing passwords. So far, the effects have been minimal. I think there's a story from this January in Texas where attackers claim to have caused a water tower to overflow. So they spilled tens of 1,000 gallons of water from the tower. Nobody was hurt. There was no damage, but they're demonstrating that they can do things like that.
Yeah, and this is maybe the first notable attack. And again, not that it was anything, drastic. It wasn't a huge loss. A lot of water spilled, but it's probably a percent, like a 1% or so of what a water tower can hold.
Mhm.
So not like, large reserves being lost. And there's certainly, reclamation treatment plants for recycling that. But it is the first one I've seen at least that they really did something. We've seen some kind of silly things with the pump stations that are really just out there to help push water once it gets beyond how gravity can move it. We need to physically pump it places. So some of the attacks recently were on those, and they were just default passwords that were things like 1111 and 1234 and public facing services, because sometimes these things auto magically enable remote access if you, for example, connect something to Ethernet instead of serial. And so, it's not complete negligence. Sometimes the products are designed to help a little bit too much, air quote. So actually getting to the point where something was a little bit destructive is a movement in a direction I think we all anticipated, but we're hoping maybe we were able to, secure some of these things better. Water facilities, holistically, are a target, and they are probably one of our most undersecured utility segments out of all of critical infrastructure.
Yeah, so CISA has a fact sheet with more details of the attack activity. They also have recommendations for hardening OT systems. They're kind of depressingly basic. Things like disconnect the OT systems from the public facing internet, or if you have to have them connected, put a firewall between the internet and the OT systems, remove default passwords, use strong passwords and multi-factor authentication, et cetera, which, as you noted, I think these are low-hanging fruit kind of attacks, basic exploits. Maybe there are more sophisticated attacks available and on deck, but so far it looks like they're just going after the low-hanging stuff.
Yep.
And we'll have that link to the CISA recommendations in the show notes if you want it. All right, let's get into the main conversation. The reason we've invited our guest, Johna from Nemertes, is to talk about tabletop security exercises. So, Johna, welcome to the podcast. And I guess, if you want to kick it off, what is a tabletop exercise? Why would an organization want to go through one? What's the point?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, JJ and Drew. And the best way to understand a tabletop exercise is it's play pretend for grown-ups. Possibly you can say structured play pretend for grown-ups. It's essentially an imaginary, or it could be a real scenario, but it's not actually happening. So you're imagining that it's happened. And what you do is you provide the participants with titrated information, the kind of in the same fashion that they would be getting information in the real world if were a security incident to occur. And they need to quickly assess the situation and develop a course of action, a COA, based on the information they have. Then they move to the next step in the tabletop exercise, work their way through the process, and then you sit down and you do the after action review, AAR, where you sit down and say, what got done, what got missed, what could have been done better, and most importantly, to get to your question, why would you do this? Where are the gaps in our incident response, IRP?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the main reason that you do it, is to uncover gaps, weaknesses, areas that you hadn't thought about in your IRP.
And all of those words in my head, I just heard cyber Dungeons and Dragons.
Pretty much. I never liked Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid because I had a better imagination than the game did. But that's essentially the idea. It's play pretend for grown-ups, and you get to be a character, and you may not be the character that you are in real life. You may be, you may not be. There are reasons to do both. And what it allows you to do really is to use your imagination to figure out what you could do, what might go wrong. And as I said previously, just uncover where you have gaps in your response.
So how would this kind of scenario be developed in the Dungeons and Dragons metaphor? Would I work with a third party to come in and sort of be the DM?
Yes. And of course, I'm biased here because this is something we do for our clients on a regular basis. So of course, I think you should be doing it with third parties. But there is actually a very real reason to do it, because it's not just about understanding what the scenario is and what a good scenario is to test. But you really, when you go in to set something up, you want to understand the parts of the IRP that you really want to fire harden, where you as a consultant see weaknesses. You also want to set it up in such a fashion that the decision tree is manageable. And you want to make sure that the people that participate are given the information in the right dosages, titrated the right amounts, so that they can make decisions in a way that causes them to think through all the parameters enough, but not too much. And all of these, they're game development skills that aren't necessarily the same skills that you might have as a cybersecurity professional. You may be the world's best cybersecurity person, but you may not be the best game developer.
And you said IRP, so I'm assuming you're talking about incident response plans here. And these exercises would be different scenarios that could be maybe physical, like acts of nature, data center destroyed, or cyber incidents like malware or ransomware, combinations of those things, or maybe loss of some asset or some part of the team. What are some of the different scenarios that are run through?
The sky is really the limit. What we typically do is we go through and check the MITRE attack framework and see what attacks have been reported recently and how interesting they are and how much fun they are. And for example, we talked a lot about the OT with the Russian attack, which is similar to, but not identical to, the attacks that they did in power stations in Ukraine. They did it a couple of times, and they're simply practicing their chops. They know how to play these games in the real world. You look at real situations that have cropped up, and then you might throw in a twist to a real situation. So, for example, as you said, maybe the key person is out with the flu, because one of the things you saw when you were looking at the client's IRP is that everything goes to Neil. And if he's not here, then oops, we don't know what to do. So all of these things you can look at, you can add a twist to them, you can add physical disruption, you can add facilities issues, and then see how they play out.
In these kind of engagements, does the organization requesting a tabletop exercise get to pick the scenario, or is it just sort of the consultant team comes in and pulls something out of the briefcase and is like, today we're doing ransomware?
Out of the briefcase, Drew.
I know, right? Who carries a briefcase anymore?
I'm imagining like you open it up and there's a bunch of folders in there and you pull one out and pull out the cards and get the dice in there and stuff.
It is kind of like that. And the way we do it is we actually base ours on military gaming, because military tabletop exercises are very well thought out and people have been doing them for centuries. So they're a great place to start when you start doing cybersecurity tabletop exercises. So we have what we call, since we don't have enough acronyms in cybersecurity, what we call TDGs, tactical decision games. And we actually do have a whole lineup of them, and we will sit down and literally ask ourselves, what is it that the client needs testing on, and then put together the TDGs. Sometimes, to answer your question, do they get to pick? Usually not, because the idea is it should be a surprise. But generally, they'll come to us and say, look, we're really worried about, say, our response to ransomware, which is a very common one. We want to know how to handle ransomware. So please give us a ransomware one or something like that. And then what we'll do is we'll work with somebody who doesn't get to play the game, because they get to see the behind the scenes, and make sure that what we're testing is really stress testing their IRP in the right directions and dimensions that they're looking for.
And something else you mentioned was, as part of this exercise, is the titration of information. What do you mean by that?
Let me take a step back. If you remember in high school English, how they talked about your point of view, and so you can have reliable narrators, unreliable narrators, you have a first person point of view, and in a first person point of view, you can only experience that which that person is experiencing. Or there's the omniscient point of view, which is, you're God and you can see everything that's going on. It's literally like that. You decide what information the participants can see as they go through the game. So that's the titration of information, because you decide, okay, these people are only going to see this and this. You don't give them the background. You don't give them the context. They're supposed to figure that out on their own, as in a real world scenario. Because if you're looking at your screen and you just got an alert, that's all you know. I'm looking at my screen and I got an alert. Now what do I do?
Got it.
So it's to simulate the real world of, let's use ransomware because that's just so common. Something starts happening to one or more machines. You don't really know who's behind it. You don't know how far it spread. You don't know who initiated it. You don't know if it's destructive or they're actually going to ask for ransom.
Exactly.
So you're just feeding them the information. It's like the little trail of nuggets as you go through.
Exactly. Like you're sitting at your desk and you suddenly discover you're trying to log into X and you can't, and then take it from there.
So let me ask it, would the scenario ever be tuned or tweaked for the specific organization or industry, or is it more how the exercise go is modified for them?
Yes, and yes. As I said, we like to take as a starting point something that's happened recently, but we also like to look at an organization's IRP so we can see where the weaknesses and stress them. We also may think about something that happens commonly in an industry. So, for example, kind of very obvious case in point, a water company brings us in, we're going to look at your OT because we know. And so we know that the Russians are likely to be going after your OT. So it's that kind of thing where you look at their industry, you look at the organization. A big piece of why we're often brought in is you look at the organization above and beyond the cybersecurity team. a lot of times the cybersecurity team, and ransomware is a great case in point, cybersecurity team knows what to do. Their problem is they'll get to a certain point and senior executives have no idea what to do because they don't understand what's going on and they don't understand what's at stake. So we did a ransomware one, for example, where we had senior executives involved and the question was pay or don't pay. And what they didn't realize, or some of them didn't realize, and this was an intentional point that we pushed them on, is that if the attacker is a nation state attacker, it's actually illegal to pay. So if it's just, a 300-pound guy in his mom's basement or whatever the trophy is, that's one thing. But if it's the Russians or the Chinese, you don't get to pay because that actually is giving money to the enemy effectively. And that can get you in a world of hurt legally. So that's the kind of thing you want to make sure that the executives actually know and have to make a decision on very quickly.
Just a brief pause to ask, did you know Packet Pushers has a job board? Whether you're looking to find or fill your next great IT infrastructure role, the Packet Pushers job board is the place to go. It's easy to post, easy to browse, and easy to apply. So whether you've got IT talent or you're looking for IT talent, visit jobs.packetpushers.net and get to work. That's jobs.packetpushers.net.
And I think that's important for all of us too, because we're talking about kind of an extreme scenario and modeling this, in the tabletops, but in daily work and in incident response, there are security teams, there's other sysadmins, architects, networking, operations, applications people. At the end of the day, none of anybody outside of a C-suite or a board really has any authority to start making decisions about what to do or not do. Everything from, are we going to shut the systems down, to, like you said, are we going to pay the ransom? And I think the tabletops sound like just an excellent way to, tease all that out ahead of time. So every person, every team knows, I'm assuming would know then, where their stopping point is when they need to pass that decision ball to somebody else and who that is.
One would hope, and that should all be in the IRP. The other groups of people that are very important at some point in a tabletop, it doesn't have to be the first tabletop, are folks like HR, because the question is, what do you tell employees? And then there's also IR, industry relations. If you're a public company, what do you tell customers? What do you tell third-party vendors? You have to have built out a framework that says, this is how we communicate, this is what we communicate, this is when we communicate it. And in general, the best way to do that as part of your IRP is to actually have these messages pre-written so that when it's time to send them, you just tweak them. And another extremely good best practice is...
I'm just like imagining like this text built out where there's an attack on a OT system or a water. Oh yeah, no. This time it's China, not Russia. Just copy and paste into here and send out number 4.
Right. It's pretty much, it's Mad Libs. We have been attacked by fill in the blank. We blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it really is. The hard thing is people need to figure out how much gets communicated to whom proactively. And most tech people don't want to do that because there are risks and actual liabilities to communicating too much too soon, particularly if you're wrong. What if you don't know who it is? Or what if you know but don't wish to say? So you have to think through all that ahead of time so you can say something like, look, we are not going to point fingers at any one nation state. We're not even going to mention that it's a nation state attack. We are simply going to say we are investigating the origin as well as taking response measures or something like that. But that's not the kind of thing you want to be thinking about on the fly. If you're the communications department of a large company, for example, you want to have thought out all the crisis communications that you're going to be sending out, and then you just tweak them to get them out. And you've already thought through all the issues of what are the risks of saying we know what we're doing when we don't actually know. What are the benefits of reaching out proactively versus waiting for people to ask us questions? All of that. Oh, and another group that needs to be involved is legal and risk management. They need to know what's going on. So typically when we do tabletop exercises, we do a technical tabletop exercise and a broader executive tabletop exercise.
Like separately?
Separately, usually, although the people are the same. In other words, the technical one is just the cybersecurity team and sometimes outside IT folks. Mm-hmm. The broader one is those folks and the senior folks. The reason to do the technical one is to make sure that your IRP at a basic technical level is accurate. You don't want to show up in front of the president of the company and have the consultant be like, hey, you should have had 2-factor authentication over here. Cough, cough. That leads to embarrassment, Senate or no.
Yes. That's interesting. You sort of want to get the technical one out of the way first, just to make sure that when the executives show up, you don't look so bad.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly.
Okay. I think the other thing that's interesting to note is that, like, I wouldn't have thought about, oh yeah, we should get the public relations team in on this. And maybe some security folks wouldn't even know they had a public relations team to bring in.
I'd say most folks are getting better at that, but yes, the thing to understand is that there are people whose job it is to communicate things effectively and well. And guess what? It's probably not the cybersecurity team. And it's great to have people do their actual jobs, what they're trained for. And usually large companies have crisis communication teams. Sometimes they don't. And of course, there's the broader question, especially now with, the SEC requirements of third-party notification. So
Right.
if you are a provider, you have to notify anyone who's downstream from you, but you should also notify folks who are upstream from you, because there's always the possibility that someone who is providing to you was the source of the incursion, and they need to know that, they have been hacked. So you have to communicate downstream and upstream. You need to know who those folks are, which gets to the other big reason to do a tabletop exercise. 99 times out of 100, the biggest weakness that pops up is communication. I forgot to mention the other fact that you need to be communicating with law enforcement.
Right.
And you need the right folks to be communicating with law enforcement. And you want to make sure that your law enforcement, the people that you're reaching out to, hey, I talked to my friendly FBI agent. Well, let's be sure that that person hasn't just changed jobs and, it's not Mary anymore, it's Sue, and things like that. And then there's always the question of, well, where is all this information stored? And if it's in one of the servers that's been hacked, all that's in Microsoft Active Directory, which
Right.
is now unreachable. So what are your out-of-band channels for communication, and where do they live? Usually people have thought about it, but really haven't taken any action that is so ingrained that everybody knows, go here, here's the directory, pull it up here on your cell phone or whatever the next steps are.
Yeah, so let's dig in then to some of the outcomes or deliverables of a tabletop exercise. I think we've touched on a little bit, but can you give us a sense of, is there something the client gets at the end besides all of the learnings that happen throughout the exercise?
Oh, absolutely. You wrap up with a set of concrete recommendations, whether it's, gosh, it really helps to have tools here, here, and here, because had you had those tools, you would have been able to find this thing out much faster, or whatever the weakness is. You can point out concrete recommendations to buy a product of category X. You can highlight recommendations for streamlining and fine-tuning their IRP, so improve your processes. You can also highlight the fact that there may be people missing in your lineup. So you've got your people, process, technology. All of those can be modified as a result of one of the tabletop exercises. So then you come back and say, here are all the changes you need to make to tools. Here are all the changes you need to make to processes. And here are all the changes you may need to make organizationally or with people. Often what doesn't exist are IRP roles. So for example, you can say, okay, this is the head of networking. What is his or her role in an incident response? And that kind of thing. So if people don't know what they're supposed to do, it's like having hall monitors or fire marshals.
Right.
You need to know that you're the fire marshal, and you need to know what a fire marshal does.
Yep.
So generally you have concrete recommendations around that. The other thing that's kind of fun, and I know people always ask, well, how many of these should you do? Like, we should do them once a year, right? At least. We've actually done primary research and found that objective security metrics, and our favorite is the median total time to contain a breach. The shorter that is, the better, right? That MTTC drops almost linearly with the number of tabletop exercises you do per year. And the folks that are the best will do roughly 6. And I'm not saying 6 is the number, but more than quarterly. And usually what they're doing is, at any given point in time, they're either doing a tabletop exercise, reviewing the results of a tabletop exercise, or planning the next tabletop exercise. And that whole process takes anywhere from 6 weeks to, 2 months, depending, especially if they have to make changes. It takes time to figure out what to buy and install it and configure it and all that.
So during the tabletops, because to me, this is almost like gamifying your work. So it sounds like fun.
It's great fun.
What is the response to the professionals? Do they like it? Do the executives think it's a waste of time? Do the technical teams huff their way through it?
I'd say the most common response is the technical teams tend to walk in with a little bit of this bored, I know everything thing at the beginning. Sometimes you can shake them out of it by the end. Sometimes you don't because they really do know everything. But what they miss is their dependence, as you said earlier, JJ, that their dependence on other arms in the organization. So they may not have thought about the fact that they have a PR team that they can be reaching out to, or this is what HR needs to do. And so they may not have a role of the cybersecurity person whose job it is to communicate within the organization. And they may think, oh, all right, you got me here. Like it's not a big deal because they view their entire job as the technical component, but it's actually a very big deal in the real world. So some of the challenges that the technical folks may say, that was easy technically. Most of the problems aren't technical problems. Most of the problems are communications problems, organizational problems, process problems. And I think they tend to underestimate the impact of those in a real event.
Is there then a couple of things to do and things to avoid or think about for an organization, like to make the most out of that experience other than, actually doing it?
Well, I'd say, first of all, embrace the idea of doing regular tabletop exercises and don't confuse them with pen testing. Pen testing is great. Do lots of pen testing, more pen testing. But it's also important to do the tabletop exercises because they expand your view of the problem. They give you a broader context. And it also starts you down the process of thinking about what could go wrong. So one of the things we've been introducing lately is the impact of deepfakes. So, okay, JJ called and said, hey, I need you to, make these changes on the server. And by the way, I'm the CISO, so of course you're going to do it. Well, how do you know that's JJ? Did you have a back channel to validate that? Because just because it sounded like her and came from her phone number doesn't mean it's JJ.
Yeah, it is scary. Actually, yesterday I got an email and all the headers checked out from someone at a client, not the person I usually work with. I got 2 emails and tried to call in to find this person through the company's main, dial the number I know, not the cell phone number at the bottom of the email. Ultimately had to text message somebody else at that organization to say, I got this email.
Is this person real?
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty sure it came from that email account. So that tells me not only do we have like the deep fakes and all this other stuff, but the email compromise of a legitimate email account possibly being compromised and adding another layer of uncertainty to that whole thing.
Identity in all its aspects is key. So it's one of those things starting to grapple with that. Like, is there a confirmed process that we use to validate identity? And how can that process be compromised? So it's a never-ending process, really, to do these. So coming back to the question, like, what can an organization do to reap the greatest benefits? Thing number 1, 2, and 3 is really embrace the idea of doing tabletop exercises because you will get benefits from them that you don't get from anything else. And that includes expanding your view of what could go wrong and what you need to protect against. And it also gets people into the comfort level of, okay, it's all right if weakness is exposed, because I like to think of it as NTSB rules, the National Transportation Safety Board rules. They have done wonders in improving our transportation infrastructure because the simple rule is you can't use the findings of any investigation to, sue somebody for $1 billion. So classic example, and I've actually gone through these with the Coast Guard. You might have a sailboat hit a cargo ship. Bad news for the sailboat, not so bad for the cargo ship. Yeah. What went wrong? Who was at fault? Even if the pilot of the cargo ship was drunk, still that has to come out. You have to go through and find every detail and then learn what it is you can do to improve things the next time. And that's where you get yourself on a steady improvement ramp. If you're willing to take this approach that says things will go wrong, people will make mistakes, processes will be incomplete, technologies will fail. Let's figure out where that's going to happen and how we can improve ourselves.
So you talked about making it clear that a tabletop exercise is very different from a penetration test, or we could also look at red, blue, purple teaming and so on. If I've got limited resources, how might I think about which one is best for my given situation? And of course, I realize there's a lot of it depends in there, but what's your thinking?
I don't know that they necessarily conflict. I guess is my problem. If your limited resources is limited funding, then you have the same conversation that you have with the CEO at any point in time, which is how much risk do you want to take? And that is a whole different conversation, which is how you justify cybersecurity expenditures, because it should be a risk-based justification. But in general, testing your environment should be at the top of the hierarchy, whether you're doing tabletop exercises or pen tests. So I would say if it's an either or, you really haven't done a very good job explaining this risk-based investment into cybersecurity. You really do need to do a tabletop exercise no matter what, because it creates a shared understanding of what some of the risks are. That said, if you've never ever done pen testing before, you probably want to start there and then follow it with a tabletop exercise.
Okay. And sort of going back to JJ's question a little bit, if I'm in the organization and looking to advocate for getting a tabletop exercise conducted, is it generally harder to bring executives on board just because they're like, I don't have the time for this, or technical people on board? How do I communicate the value to those groups to make them realize this is important?
That is a tough question. To answer your first question, I'm not sure there's a general answer. In some cases, executives, especially recently, executives really want to see what's going on in cybersecurity, so they think that's fun. So generally, they're willing to sign on. They just don't happen to have a whole day or half a day free until, November 2026,
Right.
with their booked schedules. So that's the challenge with executives. They'll be enthusiastic. Oh, sure, let me do that. But you can't get them. And tech teams sometimes have a little bit of that bored, hey, I know what I'm doing technically, go away, kind of attitude. But generally, the people that bring it on board are people who have invested in building out an IRP and want to prove that the IRP is working. So coming back to your how do you prove the value, I think it's a tough question to give a glib answer to.
Mm-hmm.
I think it really comes back to risk reduction, because you can say, well, we've spent a lot of effort. We've spent X many dollars in hours of work building out an IRP. We really owe it to ourselves to see if it even works.
Mm-hmm.
That's usually the way I can get folks to peg tabletop testing, is to peg it to the IRP and say, this is IRP fire hardening at both the technical level and the broader organizational level.
Okay, so we've already made some investments in our incident response. Let's actually run it through the book and give it a test. Yeah, see if it works.
One of the things I thought was interesting, Johna, when I was looking at your background, there's a thing under your engineering at the university about doing Monte Carlo simulations for particle physics experiments. And working with people, Monte Carlo simulations are very common in like the financial risk analysis world. And I've been looking for somebody that was applying like Monte Carlo simulations to cybersecurity for scenarios. Do you guys do that, or do you see a place for that to simulate the probability of something and kind of landing on a scenario? Do you think there's a place for that in this type of exercise?
It's an interesting idea. The problem I have with Monte Carlo simulations in a nutshell is that you're essentially saying, okay, here's my distribution. I'm going to sort of spray across this distribution. But most Monte Carlo simulators are not random, because they generate the same output every time. So it's just that the output eventually conforms to and I'm doing a Gaussian shape with my hands, whatever your desired distribution is. So the lack of true randomness is the thing that I stumble on. And not to go on a long side note, but I remember early on when one of the earliest browsers actually used a Monte Carlo simulation to do a random number generation, which means, of course, it was generating the same sequence of random numbers every single time. They were just statistically random.
Yes.
And the programmer just didn't realize that you can't do that. And it was a huge security vulnerability. So I'm kind of triggered by that. I think there's a way to do it, but I'm not sure I've gone far enough down that path to give you a good yes or no.
Okay. Maybe we'll rabbit trail down that on a side conversation later.
Sounds good.
Sounds like you need a supercomputer and some funding, and you got to start up there.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think so much more. Tabletop is actually, it gets all the way back to the Socratic method, where we do begrudgingly use PowerPoint to share the scenario so that we can see that everybody sees it at once. But pencil and paper work really, really well for tabletop exercises.
That's awesome. Okay, so John, I feel like I could talk about this more, but we do have to wrap up. But any last thoughts for listeners about tabletop exercises?
I think, Drew, pretty much the one thing I would say is do them often. It correlates with success in objective cybersecurity metrics. So the more you do them, the better you get. As we talked about earlier, they're also fun, and it's a great way to get everybody away from the tactical constraints of their day-to-day jobs and thinking about the broader big picture that they're working in.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't hurt to have some fun while you're at this too.
Exactly.
All right, Johna, thanks for joining us. And thanks to you for listening to this episode of Packet Protector. If you've got comments, corrections, or topics you'd like us to cover, or anything else to tell us, you can hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU stands for feedback. And while you're there, check out all the podcasts on our network, including Heavy Wireless with Keith Parsons, Network Automation Nerds with Eric Cho, and Heavy Strategy with today's guest, Johna Till Johnson. As always, thanks for listening.